October 21, 2009. Jefferson City, Missouri. A small Midwestern town where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played outside until dark, where evil was something that happened elsewhere, on television, in the news, in other people's lives. But evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with warning signs or declarations. Sometimes it lives next door. Sometimes it babysits your children. And sometimes it writes in a diary. This is the story of a question that should never have been asked, and an answer that destroyed two families forever. This is the story of Alyssa Bustamante and Elizabeth Olten. And before this night is over, you'll understand something terrible about human nature, something you might wish you could forget. But first, we need to go back. Back to a moment that seemed innocent. Back to when the darkness was still hidden. If you had walked through the neighborhood in St. Martin's, Missouri, in the fall of 2009, you would have seen what looked like suburban normalcy. Modest homes. Carefully maintained lawns. The kind of place where people moved to raise families away from the chaos of the city. And if you had knocked on the door of the Bustamante home, you would have met what appeared to be an ordinary teenage girl. 15 years old. Dark hair. Quiet, perhaps. A little withdrawn, maybe. But nothing that would alarm you. Nothing that would make you think twice about letting this girl watch your children. Alyssa Bustamante seemed normal. But here's what you need to understand about this case, about this story. Normalcy is a mask. And some people wear that mask better than others. Alyssa's life had been anything but normal. Abandoned by her mother, a woman struggling with addiction. Alyssa and her siblings had been raised by their grandparents. Her father was in prison. The family structure that most children take for granted had crumbled before she could even understand what stability meant. But many children face adversity. Many children grow up in broken homes, with absent parents, with trauma that leaves invisible scars. Most of them don't become killers. So what was different about Alyssa Bustamante? The answer to that question was hidden in plain sight, written in notebooks and journals, posted on social media profiles that her friends scrolled past without truly seeing. The warning signs were there. They were always there. But nobody was reading between the lines. In her online profiles, Alyssa listed her hobbies. Cutting. Killing people. She wrote it casually, the way another teenager might list shopping, or hanging out with friends. And people who saw it, they assumed it was teenage edginess. Dark humor. The kind of thing troubled kids wrote to get attention, to seem interesting, to shock their peers. Nobody took it literally. That was their first mistake. Here's something that wasn't discovered until later, something that makes this story even more unsettling. Weeks before October 21st, Alyssa Bustamante had dug 2 graves in the woods behind her house. 2 graves. Not 1. 2. Think about that for a moment. Think about the planning, the premeditation, the cold calculation required. She didn't dig them in a moment of rage or passion. She dug them in advance, methodically, with purpose. She measured the depth. She covered them with branches and leaves. She prepared. But here's the question that should make your skin crawl. Why 2 graves? Was she planning to kill 2 people from the beginning? Did she have specific victims in mind? Or was the second grave insurance, a backup, a sign that this wasn't going to be her last time? That question was never fully answered. And that uncertainty, that gap in the narrative, is part of what makes this case so deeply disturbing. We know what she did, but we may never fully understand the scope of what she intended to do. The graves sat there in the woods, waiting. And Alyssa went about her daily life, going to school, interacting with neighbors, babysitting children, including 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten, who lived just down the street. Elizabeth, who called her Alyssa, who trusted her, who had no idea that the teenager she looked up to had dug a grave with her measurements in mind. The day started normally. Wednesday. A school day. Alyssa attended classes. Elizabeth went to elementary school. Both returned home in the afternoon to a neighborhood that seemed peaceful, safe, ordinary. But Alyssa had already made her decision. Later, she would write about it in her diary. She would describe the feeling of anticipation, the waiting, the knowledge of what she was about to do. Around 6 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, sent her daughter outside to play. It was still light out. Elizabeth wanted to see if the neighbor kids could play. She walked down the street, her blonde hair catching the fading sunlight, toward the Bustamante house. Alyssa was waiting. What happened next is difficult to describe in detail, not because the facts are unclear, but because the reality is almost too brutal to comprehend. But you need to understand the truth of what occurred in those woods. You need to know what one human being is capable of doing to another. Alyssa convinced Elizabeth to follow her into the woods. Perhaps she promised to show her something interesting. Perhaps she suggested they play a game. Elizabeth, trusting and innocent, followed. And there, in the isolated darkness of the forest, Alyssa strangled Elizabeth Olten. But that wasn't enough. She stabbed the 9-year-old girl multiple times. And then, with Elizabeth dying or already dead, Alyssa cut her throat. She dragged the small body to one of the graves she had prepared. She covered it with dirt and leaves. And then she went home. Here's what makes this even more chilling. Alyssa's first words when she returned weren't confusion or panic or grief. She didn't pretend something terrible had happened. She simply asked her siblings if they'd seen Elizabeth. The mask of normalcy was still firmly in place. When Elizabeth didn't come home for dinner, Patty Price began to worry. When 7 p.m. passed, worry became concern. By 8 p.m., concern had transformed into fear. Patty called the police. What followed was every parent's nightmare, the desperate search for a missing child. Neighbors emerged from their homes. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Voices called Elizabeth's name into the void, hoping for an answer that would never come. Alyssa Bustamante joined the search. Let that sink in for a moment. The killer helped look for her victim, walking alongside Elizabeth's frantic mother, calling the dead girl's name, playing the role of the concerned neighbor. This is a pattern we see in certain types of killers: the impulse to insert themselves into the investigation, to watch the suffering they've caused, to experience the aftermath of their actions. Psychologists call it injecting themselves into the narrative. For Alyssa, it may have been part of the experience she was seeking. The search continued through the night. Volunteers combed the woods. Police expanded their radius. And with every passing hour, the hope of finding Elizabeth alive diminished. But here's what nobody knew. While they were searching, while Elizabeth's mother was crying and praying and begging for her daughter's safe return, Alyssa Bustamante was back in her bedroom, writing in her diary. And what she wrote would become some of the most disturbing words ever recorded in American criminal history. I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel ATM. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the oh my god, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kinda nervous and shaky though right now. K, I gotta go to church now, lol. Read those words again. Slowly. Let them sink in. This wasn't written by an adult psychopath. This was written by a 15-year-old girl who had just murdered a child, and who described the experience as amazing, using teenage text speak, casual language, the same tone she might use to describe a movie or a shopping trip. And that final line, K, I gotta go to church now, lol. The casual mention of church. The lol, appended as if she'd just written something amusing. The complete disconnect between the enormity of what she'd done and the triviality of her words. This diary entry would become crucial evidence. But more than that, It would become a window into a mind that most people cannot comprehend. It revealed something that the prosecution would later argue, and that Alyssa herself would essentially confirm. She killed Elizabeth Olten not out of rage, not out of revenge, not even out of hatred. She killed her because she wanted to know what it felt like. That sentence, "I wanted to know what it felt like," is perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire case. It suggests a level of detachment from human empathy so profound that murder becomes an experiment, a curiosity to be satisfied, an experience to be checked off a list. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The police still hadn't found Elizabeth's body. The investigation was just beginning, and Alyssa's mask was about to slip. The next day, police began interviewing neighbors, anyone who might have seen Elizabeth before she disappeared. They spoke to the Bustamante family. They spoke to Alyssa. And here's where we see the first cracks in her facade. Initially, Alyssa claimed she'd been home all evening. She said Elizabeth had come by, but had left to play elsewhere. She maintained the same story she'd been telling since the night before. But investigators were suspicious. They'd noticed something. Alyssa's story had small inconsistencies. Nothing major, just slight variations in details that didn't quite line up. And there was something about her demeanor that felt off. She wasn't emotional enough. She wasn't concerned enough. For a teenage girl whose young neighbor had vanished, she seemed remarkably calm. Police obtained a search warrant for the Bustamante property. They brought cadaver dogs, and those dogs immediately became interested in an area behind the house, in the woods where Alyssa had been seen earlier in the week. When confronted with the dog's behavior, when pressed with mounting evidence, when the walls began closing in, Alyssa's mask finally shattered. She confessed. But even her confession was unsettling. There was no remorse. No breaking down in tears. No begging for forgiveness. She described what she'd done with a clinical detachment, as if she were recounting something she'd watched happen rather than something she'd done with her own hands. She led police to the grave. They excavated carefully, hoping against hope that somehow Elizabeth might still be alive. But when they uncovered the small body, covered in dirt and leaves, any remaining hope died. Elizabeth Olten was gone, and the monster responsible for her death was standing there watching, a 15-year-old girl who looked like she belonged in a high school classroom, not a police interrogation room. Alyssa Bustamante was charged as an adult with first-degree murder. The case immediately became national news. A teenage girl, a child victim, a murder that seemed to serve no purpose beyond satisfying dark curiosity. But the case also raised questions that American society had been wrestling with for decades. How do we treat juvenile offenders? At what point is someone old enough to be held fully responsible for their actions? And what role does mental health play in criminal behavior? Because here's what we hadn't discussed yet. Alyssa Bustamante had a documented history of mental health issues. She had been prescribed psychiatric medications. She had been hospitalized for mental health treatment. She had, according to records that would later emerge, attempted suicide multiple times. The defense would argue that Alyssa was deeply disturbed, that her mental illness had impaired her judgment, that she needed treatment rather than punishment. They pointed to her traumatic childhood, her abandonment by both parents, her struggles with depression, and what they claimed might be other, more serious psychiatric conditions. The prosecution countered that mental illness doesn't equal insanity. That millions of people struggle with depression, anxiety, even more severe conditions, and they don't murder children. That the diary entry, with its casual tone and expression of enjoyment, proved Alyssa knew exactly what she was doing and was capable of understanding right from wrong. And caught in the middle of this legal and philosophical debate was the Olten family, who had lost their daughter, their sister, their light. For them, the question wasn't about mental health or juvenile justice or criminal responsibility. For them, It was simple. Their 9-year-old child was dead, and someone needed to be held accountable. As the trial date approached, something unexpected happened. Alyssa Bustamante agreed to a plea deal. She would plead guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. In exchange, the first-degree murder charge would be dropped, and she would face a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole, rather than life without parole or potentially even the death penalty. Many people were outraged by this deal. They felt Alyssa deserved the harshest possible punishment. They pointed to the premeditation, the graves dug in advance, the deliberate luring of Elizabeth, the brutality of the crime. How could this possibly be second-degree murder? But prosecutors had concerns. They worried about the challenges of trying a juvenile as an adult, about the mental health defenses that would be mounted, about the possibility that a jury might be sympathetic to a teenage defendant despite the horrific nature of the crime. The plea deal guaranteed that Alyssa would spend decades in prison, possibly the rest of her life. Without it, there was a risk, however small, that a jury might reach an unexpected verdict. Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, agreed to the plea deal. Not because she wanted leniency for Alyssa, but because she couldn't bear the thought of a lengthy trial, of having to relive her daughter's murder again and again in graphic detail, of taking the risk that Alyssa might somehow receive a lesser sentence. So Alyssa Bustamante stood before a judge and admitted what she had done. She pleaded guilty to murdering Elizabeth Olten. And then came the sentencing hearing, where the true horror of this case would be laid bare. In February 2012, family and friends of Elizabeth Olten stood before the court to deliver victim impact statements. These are among the most heart-wrenching moments in any criminal proceeding, when those left behind are given the opportunity to tell the court and the defendant about the person who was lost and the devastation that loss has caused. Elizabeth's mother described a little girl who loved to draw, who wanted to be a teacher when she grew up, who had a smile that could light up a room. She described the unbearable pain of losing a child, of knowing that Elizabeth's last moments were filled with terror and pain. Elizabeth's siblings spoke about the sister they would never see graduate, never see get married, never watch become an aunt to their own children. They described how the murder had shattered their sense of safety, how they couldn't sleep at night, how they flinched at every unexpected sound. And as they spoke, as they poured out their grief and rage and incomprehensible loss, Alyssa Bustamante sat at the defense table, largely expressionless. There were moments when she appeared to tear up, moments when she seemed to show some flicker of emotion. But compared to the raw, devastating pain of the Olten family, her reaction seemed muted, inadequate, almost performative. The judge listened. And then he delivered a sentence that many found surprising: life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 35 years, plus another 30 years for armed criminal action, to be served consecutively. This meant Alyssa would be at least 50 years old before she could even be considered for parole. And there was no guarantee she would ever be released. The parole board would have to determine, decades from now, whether she had been rehabilitated, whether she posed a continued threat to society. For many, this sentence felt appropriate, severe enough to reflect the seriousness of the crime, but acknowledging that Alyssa had been a juvenile at the time and that people, even those who commit terrible acts, can potentially change over decades. For others, it felt inadequate. No amount of time could bring Elizabeth back. No sentence could truly deliver justice for what had been taken. Alyssa Bustamante is currently incarcerated in the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri. She will remain there for decades to come. And while she sits in prison, the questions raised by her case continue to echo through American society. The most fundamental question is one we may never be able to fully answer. Why? Why did she do it? The diary entry suggests she wanted to experience what it felt like to kill someone. But that's an explanation, not really an answer. It tells us what she was seeking. but not why she was seeking it. What drove her to that dark curiosity? What was missing or broken inside her that made murder seem like an acceptable way to satisfy that curiosity? Was it her mental illness? Certainly, depression, even severe depression, doesn't typically manifest in murderous ideation. But combined with other factors, possible personality disorders, trauma from childhood abandonment, inadequate treatment, could it have created a perfect storm of dysfunction? Was it a failure of the mental health system? Alyssa had been hospitalized, had been prescribed medications, had been identified as at risk. But the system failed to prevent what happened. Should there have been more intensive intervention? More careful monitoring? Warning signs were there. The concerning social media posts, the self-harm, the suicide attempts. Why weren't they taken more seriously? Was it a failure of the family system? Through no fault of their own, Alyssa's grandparents had taken on the responsibility of raising children when they should have been enjoying retirement. Were they equipped to handle a deeply troubled teenager? Should social services have been more involved? Could Elizabeth's death have been prevented with better support systems in place? These questions don't have easy answers. And that's part of what makes this case so difficult, so troubling, so important. The Bustamante case forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about juvenile justice and mental health treatment. First, it raised questions about how we treat juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. Alyssa was 15 when she murdered Elizabeth. She was a child, legally speaking. But she committed an act of such brutality and premeditation that it seemed to demand adult consequences. The debate continues. Should juveniles ever be tried as adults? At what age do we hold someone fully responsible for their actions? Does the teenage brain, still developing, with incomplete impulse control and limited ability to fully understand consequences, warrant different treatment under the law? Research in neuroscience has shown that the adolescent brain is fundamentally different from an adult brain, particularly in areas related to decision-making, risk assessment, and impulse control. Does this mean teenagers who commit crimes deserve more lenient treatment? Or does it simply mean we need to be more vigilant about identifying and treating troubled youth before they can harm themselves or others? Second, the case highlighted the crisis in mental health treatment for young people. Alyssa had been in the system. She had been identified as needing help. But somehow, she fell through the cracks. The treatment she received was insufficient to prevent tragedy. How many other teenagers are out there right now, struggling with mental illness, posting concerning content online, exhibiting warning signs that go unnoticed or unaddressed? How many potential tragedies could be prevented with better mental health resources, more comprehensive screening, and earlier intervention? These aren't abstract questions. They're matters of life and death, of public safety, of preventing the next Elizabeth Olten from being killed and the next Alyssa Bustamante from becoming a killer. In all of this, the legal proceedings, the debates about mental health and juvenile justice, the media coverage and public fascination, it's crucial that we don't lose sight of who this story is really about. Elizabeth Olten was 9 years old. She loved art and wanted to be a teacher. She trusted her neighbor. She went outside to play one October evening and never came home. She didn't die accidentally. She didn't die because of illness or random tragedy. She died because another human being decided her life was worth less than the satisfaction of curiosity, because she happened to be available when a killer wanted to know what murder felt like. Elizabeth's family will never recover from this loss. They'd had to live with the knowledge of how she died, of what she endured in her final moments. They'd had to navigate a world where the person who murdered their child might someday walk free. But they've also worked to ensure Elizabeth is remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. They've advocated for victims' rights, for better mental health screening, for changes to the juvenile justice system that might prevent similar tragedies. Elizabeth's life mattered. Her death was not meaningless. And the conversations sparked by this case, difficult and uncomfortable as they are, might ultimately help protect other children, identify other troubled teenagers before they act on violent impulses, and create a society that takes mental health and public safety more seriously. We began this story with a question. What was different about Alyssa Bustamante? What separated her from the millions of other troubled teenagers who struggle but don't kill? The truth is, we may never fully know. Human psychology is complex. Criminal behavior arises from a combination of factors: genetics, environment, mental health, trauma, opportunity, choice. We can identify risk factors, but we can't predict with certainty who will become violent and who won't. What we can say is this: evil exists. Sometimes it wears the face of a teenage girl. Sometimes it lives next door. Sometimes it babysits your children. And while we can debate the role of mental illness, while we can discuss juvenile justice reform and treatment options and prevention strategies, we must also acknowledge a fundamental truth. Alyssa Bustamante made a choice. She chose to dig those graves. She chose to lure Elizabeth into the woods. She chose to kill an innocent child to satisfy her curiosity. Mental illness may have played a role. Childhood trauma may have contributed. The system may have failed her. But ultimately, she made a choice that destroyed two families and ended a young life full of promise and potential. The graves are filled now. Elizabeth lies in a cemetery, remembered by family and friends who will never stop missing her. And Alyssa sits in a prison cell, serving a sentence that will last most of her natural life. But the questions remain. The debates continue. And somewhere tonight, another troubled teenager is struggling, exhibiting warning signs that may or may not be noticed, standing at a crossroads where the wrong choice could lead to tragedy. We tell this story not to glorify violence or to satisfy morbid curiosity. We tell it because understanding these cases, as difficult and disturbing as they are, is essential to preventing future ones. We tell it because Elizabeth Olten deserves to be remembered. And we tell it because ignoring the darkness doesn't make it disappear. It only allows it to grow stronger. This was the story of Alyssa Bustamante and Elizabeth Olten. A story of childhood innocence destroyed. A story of mental illness and systemic failure. A story of a question that should never have been asked and an answer that came at the cost of a young girl's life. And as this story ends, I leave you with a final thought. In your own community, in your own neighborhood, on your own street, there may be a troubled child struggling right now. Someone who needs help, who's exhibiting warning signs, who's standing at that same crossroads. Will we notice? Will we intervene? Or will we wait until it's too late, until another Elizabeth is gone, until we're left asking why nobody saw it coming? The choice is ours. Let's make it count.